Okay, so here I have a button, and I currently have it set up so that whenever I click the button, it toggles on and off different objects. But how could I do this instead so that if you walked into the object, it would toggle on one, and if you walked out of it, it would toggle it off? So here's how I go about doing so. Now that we're outside of play mode, I just want to open up my Udon graph. And now that we're in the graph, I'm just going to go Shift Spacebar to full screen this. And we need to do a couple of changes. So currently this is set up, this is the last one I did in my tutorial, which is the networked one. And it is set up to be, well, networked. So we want to come into our bool and we just want to disable synced. We also want to disable public because that was never actually needed in the first place. I've learned a bit about Udon since. Okay, so now that we've got that, we can get rid of the request serialization node as we are no longer trying to serialize this because it's no longer synced or anything. And we don't want the interact because we don't need that anymore. And so all we're left here is the toggle on and toggle off events. And then whenever this bool changes, it will fire off all this logic to turn on and off the objects in association with the bool up here. So in order to do this, we first need some events. So we need the event on player trigger enter. And we need the event on player trigger exit. Now with these, we'll be able to know whether or not the player's walked in or out of the trigger. But, okay, the biggest problem about this node, however, is that it plays for whenever any player walks into the trigger. However, we don't want that to happen because it's really hard to figure out to make objects turn on and off if any player is in the trigger, so I'm not going to cover that here. But if we just want to do it for the local player, it's pretty easy, but we need to check whether or not it's the local player that walked into the trigger. So I want to create a player API is local node, and we can plug the player API into the player API is local. This player API will tell us what player walked into the trigger, and using this as local variable, we'll know whether or not that is the local player that walked into the trigger. So we just want to plug that into a branch node, and we just want to plug the bool into that branch node. So now just deleting this toggle on event, if I plug that directly in. So now whenever the player walks into the trigger, it will check whether or not it's the local player, and if it is the local player, it will turn this bool on, which will turn on our game objects that we have over here. So we just want to do the same for the player trigger exit. And now, whenever the player walks into the trigger, it should turn on the objects, and when the player walks out of the trigger, it should turn off the objects. Now, I believe this is fixed in the later versions of the SDK, as I've never run into this issue again since I first discovered it, but you also might want to create an event on player respawn node, and once again, check whether or not it's a local player, and just turn off the bool if that is the case. VRChat's gotten a lot better over the years, and I'm pretty sure the on-player trigger exit gets called if the player respawns when they're inside a trigger. But if you run into any issues with that, add this into your code and you should be fine. Awesome, so now if we were just to playtest this, now that we're in the world, we should be able to close the menu, and when we walk into the trigger, it should change it to the other objects, and when we walk out, it should turn it off. Awesome, so hopefully this was helpful for you if you didn't quite understand how this worked. See you in the next one. Bye!